Hi, my name is Ted Weber. I'm a certified ecologist, a climate adaptation analyst for Defenders of Wildlife, and chair of the Climate Reality Baltimore chapter. I'm going to give a quick overview of climate adaptation for wildlife, plants, and ecosystems. I'll take questions at the end. There are two main categories of response to climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, either by reducing our sources or by pulling them out of the atmosphere. Adaptation is the adjustment of natural or human systems to reduce negative climate change impacts. The usual way of dealing with conservation problems or other issues is to try to address the threat directly, or try to act on the factors that drive that threat. With most conservation problems and societal problems, we tend to attack the problem directly, like halting poaching or preventing habitat destruction. Climate change is different in that managers can't solve the problem on their own. Obviously, we all have to work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in the meantime, there is still the problem of negative impacts to species, ecosystems, and human communities. We can increase the resilience to such impacts, though, and lessen their effects. For example, inland flooding can be reduced by restoring forests and wetlands and capturing stormwater runoff before it reaches streams and rivers. The vulnerability of a species, ecosystem, or human community to climate change is a factor of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure measures the local change in climatic conditions. Sensitivity measures how much that change might affect a certain species, ecosystem, or community. And adaptive capacity measures the ability of a species, ecosystem, or community to respond to the threats. Climate change adaptation strategies include resistance, which is attempting to keep a system intact and relatively unchanged; resilience, which is improving the system's ability to bounce back from a disturbance; and transformation, which is facilitating the system to respond in new ways, like planting species adapted to a hotter climate. Resistance strategies include things like protecting existing ecosystems from development, overharvesting, and stressors like fire, disease, and invasive species. They also include restoration, like restoring degraded streams and planting riparian vegetation, or restoring wetlands or dune systems. Resistance strategies also include protecting climate refugia, which are areas that heat up slower or remain moist as the climate changes. Environmental changes, whether relatively sudden, like fires, storms, or floods, or more gradual, like changes in climate, are typically patchy. Some areas are affected more than others. Refugia are areas where species, natural communities, or ecosystems can persist within a larger area that has been rendered inhospitable. They can occur at different scales of space and time and provide a temporary safe havens. Effective climate refugia protect at-risk species and ecosystems, may often, although not always, occur in large natural areas, and provide connectivity stepping stones and population resilience. Disturbance refugia are areas more likely to persist through disturbances like fire, drought, storms, or insect outbreaks, or more likely to recover from them. Since climate change is likely to increase the frequency and magnitude of many types of disturbances, identifying disturbance refugia is essential to maintain local species and ecosystems. This figure shows examples of processes and landscape features that help form disturbance refugia. These can be natural, like terrain shading, rivers and lakes, or moist soils, or human constructs like roads and trails. Roads can have a lot of negative ecological effects, but can serve as fire breaks. Climatic refugia operate on longer scales of time. Such areas are relatively buffered from changes in regional environmental conditions, like temperature or moisture, and allow organisms to persist as long as local conditions remain tolerable. Climate change refugia may only be temporary for a given species, but can delay ecosystem transitions for decades or longer. They can serve as a slow lane, protecting native species and ecosystems from negative effects of climate change in the short term, providing longer-term havens for overall biodiversity and ecosystem function, and reducing the risk of extinction. This isn't the first time species have had to adapt to a changing climate, although it's happening a lot quicker now and potentially to a greater extreme. During the Pleistocene, organisms took refuge from unfavorable climate conditions during glacial advances and retreats. These areas act as sources for colonization when conditions beyond the refugia became more favorable. For example, areas in the southeast U.S. served as refugia during the last glacial maximum 18,000 to 25,000 years ago. Approaches for identifying future climate refugia include identifying regions that are projected to experience less severe climate changes, that contain diversity of physical and topographic features, and that either retain or remain close to suitable climatic conditions for a particular species. Strahlberg et al. Used species distribution models for 324 trees and 268 songbirds in the US and Canada, along with predicted changes in habitat suitability to identify areas more suitable as climate refugia. So the map shows an overlay of areas that were less likely to change in habitat value for these hundreds of trees and songbird species on average, with the bluest areas ranked as serving as the best refugia. So they found that the potential for future refugia was highest in mountain ranges and coastal areas. This picture shows examples of areas at a smaller scale that could provide suitable climate refugia. Shaded areas like north-facing slopes receive less solar heating and will stay cooler by around 2 to 6 degrees Celsius, which is quite a bit, depending on steepness and other factors. Valleys and coves that pool cold air will also stay cooler. Areas near large deep lakes or oceans will also warm more slowly due to the high heat capacity of water. Cold water springs and streams will remain relatively cold if fed by groundwater. Persistent snow can provide critical habitat for species like snowshoe hares and wolverines. And tree canopies keep the ground beneath them cooler during the day. For humans, protecting and restoring forests and wetlands can reduce flooding during storms and retain needed water during droughts, among their many other benefits. Wet areas, including wetlands, riparian zones, and fog belts, can act as climate change refugia, especially if fed by groundwater. They can remain wet or moist during droughts, and this moisture can also cool the air. Many wetlands, especially if underlain by impermeable clay or water-retaining peat, can hold water for a long time. Wetlands, as long as their soils are saturated or moist, are more resistant to fire and may also protect surrounding uplands from drought and fire. Here are some examples of climate change refugia in the Sierra Nevada range, including areas where cold temperatures and snowpacks persist, areas that are less likely to burn, wet areas, and old-growth forest. As I mentioned earlier, forest canopies moderate the temperatures beneath, keeping the ground cooler during the day and also warmer at night. They can provide important refugia if they are protected from severe natural or human disturbances. Forests are also critical carbon storehouses, especially old growth or mature forest. The benefits of forest conservation included not only carbon sequestration, but biodiversity protection, flood protection, aquifer recharge, recreation, and many other ecosystem services. In arid or semi-arid regions, groundwater-fed seeps and springs are biodiversity hotspots. Many contain rare species, like the Moapa dace showed here. Some springs may provide stable hydrologic refugia during droughts and are critical to fish and other water-dependent species. They also provide sources of water and food for nearby wildlife. The groundwater source must be protected for these springs to persist, and native vegetation protected or restored if necessary. Cold water aquatic organisms like salmon, trout, hellbenders, spring salamanders, and a number of macroinvertebrate species are among the most vulnerable taxa to climate change. They are becoming more and more restricted to persistent cold water habitats like forested headwater streams, spring-fed streams, and habitats supported by groundwater or seasonal snowmelt. Streams and rivers with cold groundwater inputs provide cold, sustained stream flows in regions where water temperatures would otherwise become too warm or stream flows too low during the summer months. Shading by valley walls or trees can also help regulate stream temperatures. Sufficiently large and connected cold water stream networks can provide refugia for sensitive freshwater organisms facing increasing pressure from temperature increases and other stressors. The figure on the left illustrates a sample aquatic refugia system. To maintain viable populations, fish require sufficient food, protective cover from predators, suitable water quality, appropriate flow regimes, spawning substrates, and the capacity to deal with parasites and diseases. Refugia should meet all of these needs, as well as shelter from high temperatures, floods, and droughts. And they should be large enough and connected enough to support viable populations of the aquatic species of concern. In some cases, barriers, depicted by a black bar in the figure on the left, may be needed to keep out predators, invasive competitors, or diseases. The surrounding drainage area or watershed should be managed to provide stable flows and minimize pollution, because aquatic systems are not just the stream channels themselves, they're the valleys in which they occur and the watershed in which they occur, the entire drainage area, the entire area affected by the hydrology. The figure on the right shows cold water refuges in Massachusetts, which are the dark blue circles. A on the top under current conditions, and B on the bottom in a modeled 4 degrees Celsius warming scenario. In the figure B, red circles indicate existing cold water refuges likely to lose cold water habitat in summer months. It is also important to identify areas that may serve as climate corridors to facilitate long-distance migration. Climate corridors can be modeled between current and future distributions of species or climate types. Predictions from corridor models have been shown to correlate with dispersal routes and gene flow. Some examples of climate corridors include preserving natural corridors or stepping stones from south to north in the northern hemisphere, or up to higher elevations, allowing species to move to more suitable climates. Likewise, corridors can be identified from drought-impacted areas to areas with more available water. Streams and rivers and the adjacent riparian zone can make especially suitable corridors if they are protected and restored if necessary. In 2019, scientists supported a call for action in the Global Deal for Nature, which recommends protecting at least 30% of Earth's terrestrial and marine systems by 2030. Such protection should be targeted to achieve the maximum benefits to biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. In a recent report, Getting to 30 by 30, Guidelines for Decision Makers, Defenders of Wildlife conducted a national-level analysis combining protected area, biodiversity, and ecosystem carbon data to identify such priority areas. This analysis and similar analyses are snapshots in time, though, focusing on the current state of the environment and not considering habitat suitability in a changing climate. Consideration of future conditions can complement efforts to preserve current biodiversity and ecosystem service hotspots, wilderness areas, and wildlife corridors. Therefore, Defenders of Wildlife is working to identify and map areas that could serve as important refugia and climate corridors for native species. Protecting refugia may save countless species from extinction as temperatures rise, rainfall patterns change, and disturbances like fire and disease outbreaks increase. Since human well-being relies on healthy ecosystems, this investment will help humanity adapt as well. Those refugia with the greatest resilience and highest biodiversity values could be included in protected area networks. The size of the refugium is important. It should be large enough to support a viable population of desired species or natural communities. The maps above show other examples of broad-scale climate refugia and corridor identification. On the right, the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes maps resilient lands and significant climate corridors across eastern North America. On the left, as mentioned earlier, Strawberg et al. Used temperature and moisture thresholds for tree and songbird species to model current and future habitat suitability. From this and other data, they modeled climate refugia and climate corridor potential. To represent the full range of diversity, they stratified their rankings within each major biome. Only 20% of top-ranking areas are currently protected, so there's a lot of work to do. Finally, climate refugia and corridors should be monitored and managed to ensure they serve their purpose. Climate change refugia should be monitored to see how well the species of concern are doing and if any stressors are present. The refugia may need to be managed to counter increased flooding, wildfire, pest and pathogen outbreaks, and invasive species. They should be managed to ensure they continue to serve as suitable habitat for the species and ecosystems of concern as long as possible. Climate change refugia may be transient. They may be suitable for 1 degree Celsius of warming, but at higher temperatures, like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, they may be too hot or dry or otherwise unsuitable for the species they harbor. However, they may still be suitable for more heat-tolerant or drought-tolerant organisms, including other species of concern. Management intensity may need to increase over time as the climate continues to change, and changes to management goals may be necessary. Some other refugia management recommendations. In the case of fire refugia, managers can practice fire suppression and exclusion, as well as restoration practices like prescribed fires, thinning trees, and allowing some wildfires if they benefit the ecosystem. Practices that reduce water stress may protect trees from fire, drought, and insect outbreaks. Threats to springs and other groundwater-fed systems should be addressed, as mentioned earlier. And restoration of degraded aquatic ecosystems can include removal of flow diversion infrastructure, exclusion of livestock, reduction of other human impacts, geomorphic restoration, invasive species removal, and planting native riparian vegetation. Some species can adapt physiologically or behaviorally. For instance, pika have been referred to as a poster child for climate change due to their temperature sensitivity and restricted range. They're found in mountain tops, upper mountain regions of the Rockies. Recent observations, though, have revealed that they can change their behavior to adapt to a warmer climate, including spending more time in the shade, shifting their diets, drinking more water, moving more in twilight hours, and changing their body postures. It's not clear yet to what extent they can behaviorally compensate for coming climate change. Resilience strategies improve a system's ability to bounce back from a disturbance. This can be done by reducing other ecosystem stressors, like restoring native vegetation, limiting pollution, reducing hazardous fuels and thereby preventing catastrophic fires, and controlling invasive species. Wildlife can also be helped by providing resources like nest boxes if needed. Transformation strategies help ecosystems to respond in new ways. For example, improving landscape connectivity to allow wildlife and plant range shifts, or actively introducing species that are more heat tolerant, or if applicable, drought tolerant or salt tolerant. Climate adaptation will often employ multiple types of strategies. At Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on Maryland's eastern shore, dredged silt and sand were used to build up an area of marsh that was disappearing from sea level rise. Then marsh grasses were planted, and at the same time, invasive nutria were removed because of their impact on marsh grasses. The refuge is also acquiring forest and farmland at adjacent higher elevations where the marsh can migrate over time and continue to provide marsh bird habitat and other benefits. There's often overlap between adaptation and mitigation. For example, saving and restoring coastal marsh also sequesters carbon in the form of peat. And that's it for the presentation, and I'll take any questions.